Hi, welcome back to Cybersecurity for Everyone. I'm Dr. Charles Harry. In our last episode, we talked a lot about how internet technology had been developed in the lab and had started to bring in members of the private sector to develop other parts of internet technology. In this episode, I want to talk a lot more about how that is further privatized and how it's scaled. How do we actually start building a more global utility? So the fundamental question here is, how do we manage this thing that we've built, this great idea that started in the late 50s and early 60s and starts to develop a little bit and become a little bit more mature in the 70s. How do we actually manage this thing? And so by the early 1980s, internetworking has really become more popular. But most of the networks that are developed are very specific. They're built for a particular purpose. NASA, Department of Energy are two examples of very specific networks that are developed utilizing this technology from the 1960s and 1970s. And so a variety of different protocols, remember, protocols are just simply instructions, are utilized to communicate, but they create a challenge for broader adoption, because if everyone's using different sets of instructions, it's hard to actually create a standard, right? It's hard to broadly communicate with one another. And so at the heart of all these purpose-driven networks, the way that they actually can communicate with one another is still this ARPANET system that was developed by DARPA starting in the late 1960s and throughout the 1970s. So ARPANET is really at the heart of all these connections of these purpose-driven networks, which creates a problem. So if we look back at the origins of ARPANET in 1969, you'll notice in this map, there's just a handful of the nodes that we originally discussed in a previous episode. That starts to develop further as time goes on. In 1970, we now see connections back to the East Coast. And by 1973, it expands even further. By 1982, you can see the development of several different networks on both coasts and also in the heartland of the United States. And so by the early 1980s, we see, in essence, the emergence of a broader set of networks. But ARPANET is still at the center. It's still the connective tissue between these independent networks, which poses a problem. Because remember, when we first talked about the origins of the internet, the broader vision was that there was no single authority. We want to create a set of independent networks that have the ability to work together. And so if ARPANET remains at the heart of the internet, then we don't actually achieve that broader vision. So the goal is to allow networks to independently communicate with one another. And so we look back to some initial work that was done in the late 60s and into the early 1970s, specifically the invention of Internet Protocol and Transmission Control Protocol, or TCP. And it becomes universally adopted in 1984. Now, at this time, you have to remember, there were lots of different protocols that were in use. By adopting a universal protocol, we actually see the birth of the modern internet. So this is a key period in the history of the internet. So after the adoption of TCP/IP as the universal standard, the government wants to get out of the middle of this internet. ARPANET at the time had been the central connective tissue. It's pulling itself out. And it wants to incentivize the private sector to build out additional infrastructure. So while the National Science Foundation builds out a large-scale, cross-country, high-speed set of network connections, it prohibits the private sector from utilizing those particular connections. And the reason they do that is to incentivize the private sector to build out its own infrastructure. And by doing so, the government is further pulling itself out as being the central node in the internet. It encourages private sectors to now actually go out and get customers for these networks that they're building. So again, additional incentives by the government to make this a lot larger than simply a research project. And this leads to the first large-scale sets of investments in the build-out of internet infrastructure. And this is really the first internet boom. Oftentimes when we think about the internet boom, we think of the late 1990s and the World Wide Web, things like pets.com. But this is really the first internet boom, where we start seeing broad-based private investment in large-scale infrastructure. And so that NSFnet, that set of high-speed interconnections, really crisscrosses the United States and broadly connects research centers all across the country. But the government doesn't want to get completely out of the picture. They still want to support research in this area. And in 1986, the Supercomputer Network Study Act of 1986 was introduced by Senator Al Gore. And this is oftentimes, you hear these jokes about Al Gore inventing the internet. And what he's oftentimes talking about is his support in introduction of legislation that increased investment in internet-based technologies. That act allocated $600 million for high-performance computing and specifically looked to accelerate the development of high-speed networking. It also provided funding for a couple of different research centers, one of which, the National Center for Supercomputer Applications at the University of Illinois, led to the development of what later became the core technology behind the Mosaic web browser. Now, we'll talk more about Mosaic in another episode, but I want to highlight the fact that the government, while not being at the center of the internet anymore, by pulling itself out of running ARPANET and having ARPANET to connect all these various networks, is not totally out of the picture. It's just redefined its role. So what are the takeaways? Well, first and foremost, the birth of the modern internet takes place in 1984 with the adoption of TCP/IP protocol. Because remember, there were all these different competing protocols out. In addition, these broad-based incentives for the private sector to build out its own networks and for it to develop its own customer base was a way for the government to more broadly have internet technology be accepted. And finally, the government wanted to support additional research, specifically in the area of high-speed networking, as a way to more readily make services on the internet available and useful for a variety of different customers. In our next episode, we're going to talk about the next internet boom, specifically the development of the World Wide Web and how that began to transform how we actually utilize the internet. Hope to see you next time.